Hey everyone, this lecture today is going to be about biodiversity. And so we define conservation biology as the applied science of maintaining the Earth's biological diversity. And biodiversity is really just kind of a contraction for biological diversity. So the term biodiversity was first coined by E.O. Wilson in the early 1980s, and he's now thought of as the father of biodiversity. So biodiversity is really the diversity of life in all of its forms and at all levels of organization. So it includes all living things from bacteria to blue whales. And when I say at all levels, what I mean is levels like species diversity, genetic diversity, and ecosystem diversity. So you're starting with genetic diversity from like diversity within an organism, species diversity, so diversity across a single species, and then community or ecosystem diversity, which you're looking at the entire community. So today we're going to talk about species and ecosystem diversity, and then your next lecture for the first one for next week is going to be about genetic diversity. So there's two ways that you can look at each of these levels. You can look at structural biodiversity or you can look at functional biodiversity. And structural biodiversity is really what is there. So how many different families, what's the taxonomic diversity, how many different species are there? So it's really like counting what's there. Functional biodiversity is looking at what each thing does. So primary productivity, nutrient cycles. So it's looking at the diversity in the functions that each type of thing gives us. So the functions that you get for each level. And that you can use either of those within any of these levels of biodiversity, so genetic, species, or ecosystem. When we talk about biodiversity, usually we're talking about structural biodiversity. So how many species are there? How many different genetic traits are there? How many different ecosystems are there? We're not usually talking about the functional biodiversity. So last week, we talked about reasons why we should be conserving nature, right? And it's really why we should conserve biodiversity. So what does it do for us would be our instrumental values. And then nature having its own right would be our intrinsic values. And remember that our instrumental or utilitarian values we're really talking about like the goods and services that we can get from nature. So when we're talking about conserving biodiversity, a lot of the effort that goes into it is because we're trying to protect our utilitarian values. But of course, some things we do protect for their intrinsic values. So that's the idea behind Leopold's land ethic. And it's really what's accepted by a lot of conservation biologists. And it's also been reflected in some of the laws, like the Endangered Species Act. So getting into species diversity. So on Earth, we have about 2 million described species. And what I mean by described species is these are species that have been officially named. So there's a lot of processes that go into the description process. So first you need to recognize that it's different and new from something that we already have. We need to provide a description of what it's like and how it differs from other things. You need to establish a scientific name. You need to designate a representative example of this species. And what I mean by that is you'll have maybe a specimen that is an example of the average look that species has. And we call those examples that represent the species a type. So every species out there has a type, which is just a representative of exactly what that species should look like. And then all of these things have to be published. So it takes a lot of work to really define a species. There's a lot of work that goes into it. And even though we've described 2 million species, we believe like that there could be anywhere from 6 million to 120 million species out there. So we really have only just scratched the surface on what we've described. And when we look at what we've described and what we haven't, we see that we really haven't described most of viruses and bacteria. The blue here are the ones that we described, and the green are ones that we have not described. So you can see the line down the middle here for insects. We've described about half, if not maybe even less, because right here we're even showing that it could be even more. There's 5 to 10 million insects. Plants, we've gotten most of those actually, so that's a plus. We've gotten most of the plants described. Not very many spiders, not very many fungi, only maybe a third of mollusks. Most of the vertebrates have been described, so we're doing pretty good with that. But of course, those are the things that we're able to see much easier. Whereas when we get up to here now, we have like algae and protists. These are things that we don't necessarily see everywhere, and they're a lot harder to determine that they are new species, so we really have only described a very little bit of them. Same thing with crustaceans and nematodes. And then viruses and bacteria, we have described almost none. You can barely see any line here for what we have described. So there's a ton to still discover. We are by no means even close to done discovering new species. So when I say a species, you got to think, what is a species? And we all kind of have this idea of what a species is. We kind of know, but it's kind of hard to put into words. So when you're describing a species, there is a taxonomic binomial to describe a species, which is the genus name and the species name. So you have the genus and species. And above that, there's other classifications. So we start with the kingdom, which is the highest classification. So let's say we're trying to get to this Blackburnian warbler, it's a type of bird. You would have the kingdom Animalia. Then a smaller classification would be the phylum Chordata. Then class Aves, which is birds. Order Passeriformes, songbirds. And then we have the family Parulidae. And then we go to genus and species. So it takes quite a bit to narrow it down to species, but what really defines a species, right? So how do we know that this bird here is a different species than this bird here and a different one from that one there? So the way that we've defined this, there are really 4 different species concepts that scientists have come up with, and none of them are perfect. None of them will encompass every species. So it's really a combination of these concepts that we use in order to define a species, because every single one of these concepts will have exceptions. So the first one we're going to talk about is the morphological species concept. And what this says is that species are defined based on morphology or physical characteristics, so how they look. We still use this today in practice. It works a lot of the time. It's probably the one that we all think of the most when we talk about a species. We're like, that looks different than that. Obviously, they're different species, right? But it doesn't always work. So, for example, if we look at blue geese and snow geese, these are 2 different looking geese, right? But they're actually the same species. So blue geese just have a different color morph than snow geese. And we call them different names, but they're the same species. You can also see it in variation in regions, so geographic variation. You look at king snakes, and these are all the same species, but they come in all these different colors depending on where they live. And what that has more to do with this one is blending into your natural environment, right? So if you're in a different type of environment, you're going to have a different color scheme in order to blend. Then we have ones where it's the opposite effect. So we look at the eastern and western meadowlark, and they look almost identical, but they have very different songs. And it turns out the females of each species will only respond to the song of their same species. So they won't mate with the other species. So these are two different species, but they look pretty similar. And there's countless examples where relying on morphology won't work. There's a greater and lesser tree frog that look exactly the same, but are not the same species. So the morphological species concept really doesn't work all the time. Even if you look at us and you see the diversity amongst us, if someone came here and they knew nothing about humans and they just went entirely on the morphological species concept, they might not think that humans are all the same species, because we look very different. We have a very strong genetic diversity, but of course we are all the same species. So again, you really can't rely on just the way something looks. So the next species concept would be the biological species concept. And what that one stresses is that groups of interbreeding or potentially interbreeding natural populations that are reproductively isolated from other such groups. So these are groups of organisms that are able to breed with each other and produce offspring. So there are a lot of problems with this concept. We can't apply it to everything. We can't apply it to fossils because we don't know what these fossils would breed with, right? They're not alive. We can't tell. We also can't apply it to asexual individuals. There are a lot of species that reproduce asexually, and we don't know what's the same species because they're not mating with anything. Then there's things like allopatric populations. So these are species that were widely separated geographically and will never interact because they don't live anywhere near each other. So we won't know if they can ever inbreed. They're never given the chance. This is the concept that the Endangered Species Act uses, though. So the biological species concept is the main one that the Endangered Species Act will use to determine what a species is. So there's another example of when this wouldn't work. When we look at lions and tigers, obviously these are two different species, right? We look at them, if you use the morphological species concept, they are absolutely different species. But the problem is they can mate and they can produce a liger or a tiglon. So depending on if it's a male or female of each species. And even though other animals that can do this, like a horse and a donkey creating a mule, mules are sterile. They're not able to reproduce after that. So it's an easy thing to say, okay, it has to be a fertile offspring for it to be a species. But the problem with this is that ligers are fertile. Ligers can mate and they can produce more offspring. So it's not, so under this concept, tigers and lions are the same species. So you're really seeing like it's not one concept that can tell us. We really have to look at everything. Another example will be looking at grizzly bears and polar bears that are now producing growler bears. In the past, they had not ever come into contact with each other because they lived in different habitats. But now with climate change, the polar bears are going, the grizzly bears are going more north and they're interacting with the polar bears, and now we're getting hybrids. Same thing with coyotes and wolves. You can get a coy wolf creating hybrids. So there are different circumstances in which the biological species concept really doesn't work. Then we have the evolutionary species concept. So for this concept, it says that species are independent evolutionary units with their own fate and tendencies. So they're different kinds of organisms adapting to the environment in different ways and going in different evolutionary directions. So the reason this one is criticized is because it's kind of subjective, because they use the word different. But how different is different enough? What really is different? That's a relative term, right? So there's no specific value for what difference really is in this. And it's a little harder to define in species. So it's a little harder to figure out. But this one is more readily used in things like fossils. This is one of the ones we use for that. And if we already know the evolutionary line, it's a little easier to differentiate. But for new things, it's harder to tell. So then we have the phylogenetic species concept. And what this says is species are the smallest diagnosable monophyletic group. So those are the branch tips on a phylogenetic tree. So we'll look at one of those. So what they're saying here is that a species would be these top of the branches. So this is so this right here is a cladogram, and it's showing you the different groups. So this will be the farthest ancestor, then this is a more recent ancestor, and then at the top, these would be our current species that we have. So a monophyletic group is saying that it includes a group of organisms that all descended from a common ancestor. So you have the ancestor and all of its descendants. When you say something like polyphyletic, what that's saying is that it's composed of organisms that are unrelated or descended from more than one ancestor. So these are not directly from the same ancestor. So E descended from C, G descended from F. Now, if they had circled all of this, then it would be monophyletic. But right now we're just looking at a couple. Then you have paraphyletic, which is a taxon that includes the most recent common ancestor, but not all of its descendants. So because they included ancestor A here, and they're not including these descendants, this makes it paraphyletic. So with the phylogenetic species concept, they're saying that any species would just be our most recent part on this tree. The problem is we need to know where it lies on the tree in order for that to work. So if we don't know the evolutionary lineages of an animal or a plant or any species, then we're not able to really define where it lies on the tree. There are even some things that we know pretty well that we aren't really sure where they lie on the phylogenetic tree. So for example, turtles. We're not really 100% sure where they lie on a phylogenetic tree. There's a few theories about where turtles should be. So it gets pretty difficult to do. And some critics say that the better we understand a group, the more species we recognize, which would probably cause a drastic increase in the number of recognized species. And there's a lot of unrecognized groups that have this characteristic, but we don't know exactly where they fit into the phylogenetic tree. So that's like what I was saying with the turtles. Also, there's no guarantee that things that are on a separate branch tip will not come together in the future. So right now they may look different. We may think they're different species, but in the future they may become one species. So we're looking at like tigers and lions. They're mating, they're creating a new individual. Is that new individual now a new species? It's hard to tell. So in the future, we're not really sure what's going to happen. So the take-home message for all of these is that nature is complex. We might not be able to come up with one definition for what a species is, but species are maintained by gene flow, and a breakdown in gene flow will lead to speciation. So we can use all of these types of definitions in order to come up with a general idea of what we define a species as. But it's really not as simple as just one definition. It really depends on context. So there are some other categories that we need to take into account when we're looking at biodiversity. When we say species, it doesn't always just mean species. For example, when we were talking about the Endangered Species Act, they don't just count species, right? We mentioned in the last lecture that they count subspecies and they'll count distinct population segments. So we really need to understand what these things mean. So a subspecies is a taxonomic category. It's very long been recognized. It is used for populations of a species that are able to be distinguished by one or more of their characteristics. And we define it by a 70% rule. So what this means is at least 70% of individuals in each subspecies must be distinguishable from all other subspecies. So if there's too much overlap, then they cannot be considered their own subspecies. In zoology, it must be allopatric or parapatric, not sympatric. And what allopatric means is that it's a geographic relationship where they are geographically separated. Parapatric is a geographic relationship where they are adjacent but not overlapping. So what that means is if you have two subspecies of an animal, their populations cannot be overlapping one another. You can't have two subspecies existing in the same spot. They need to be either separated or they can be adjacent, but they don't cross over and overlap with each other. For plants, a lot of plants can be sympatric as well. They can be allopatric or parapatric, but they can also be sympatric, which means they're found in the same geographic area. So there can be overlap in plants. So subspecies are recognized by a trinomial. So a typical species would be a binomial, which is two names. So for example, the binomial for the mountain lion is Puma concolor, whereas the subspecies would have three names. So it's Puma concolor corii. That would be the Florida panther. So it's still the same genus species, and then we just add the subspecies as the third name. So another category is an evolutionary significant unit. And what this is it's populations that have been reproductively isolated long enough to have evolved significant genetic or ecological differences. They developed to provide a basis for prioritizing taxa for conservation. So that's what this was developed for. And a evolutionary significant unit must have at least one of the following criteria. They either have to have current geographic separation, so they cannot be in the same place, or they need to have genetic differentiation at neutral markers among related ESUs caused by past restriction or of gene flow, or they need to be locally adapted phenotypic traits caused by differences in selection. Okay, so an ESU, I'll give you an example. So one that would work with the current geographic isolation would be, imagine that you have a species that lives on a large plain, and the plain is divided by a river. Now, the river's tiny. Individuals are able to cross the river. They interbreed. They're considered one population. They're not genetically distinct from another. But then, over time, the river gets wider. And it starts to flood. You've got a wide river that the animal can no longer pass over. So now they can't cross the river, and they can't breed with each other. And even more time goes by, maybe hundreds, maybe thousands of years, a lot of time goes by, and these two populations that were once the same, now they become different. So they'll become more genetically distinct from one another. And if enough time passes, they might even become a different subspecies or a different species. So that's a pretty common way for speciation to occur. But the problem is, what happens when they're in that intergrade zone? So when they're not a distinct subspecies yet. They probably deserve to be protected and given the chance to survive. But even though maybe this population's doing great and there's still a whole bunch more of them, this little population here that at the top that is a relatively new population and has been genetically isolated and has changed over time, they might need extra help. But if we don't consider them their own evolutionary significant unit and we consider these two still the same, they're not going to get any help. So that's the purpose of an evolutionary significant unit. It is to give these types of populations the help that they need. Another category is a management unit. And what that's used for is to describe local populations that have limited dispersal and genetic differences. So that's something we see in like fishery stocks. We also have distinct population segments. Now, this is very similar to an ESU, to an evolutionary significant unit, but what makes this different is it includes political boundaries. So things can be a distinct population segment and an evolutionary significant unit, but if it involves a political boundary, it has to be a distinct population segment. And where that comes into play is, for example, looking at bald eagles. We have protection over bald eagles in the lower 48 states, but we don't in Alaska. And the reasons for that is because their populations in Alaska are doing fine. They're doing great up in Alaska. But the lower 48 states, they've declined quite a bit. And they're doing better now, but we still have protection over them. So that's not necessarily something that you would do with a lot of species, but because we have these political boundaries there and we view the Alaska population as its own segment and we view the lower 48 populations as another segment, we're able to protect just one segment instead of all of them. So there are some provisions of the Endangered Species Act that we should talk about real quick before we go any further. The term endangered species means any species which is in danger of extinction throughout all or a significant portion of its range, other than a species of the class Insecta, insects, determined by the Secretary of State to constitute a pest whose protection under the provisions of this act would present an overwhelming and overriding risk to man. So what that's saying is that an endangered species is any species that is going to go extinct if we don't intervene, with the exception of pest insects. We don't include pest insects. The term species is including any subspecies of fish or wildlife or plants. It's funny, they don't consider fish wildlife. It's weird. And any distinct population segment of any species of vertebrate fish or wildlife which interbreeds when mature. Okay, so that's the Endangered Species Act's definition of species. So they go by their own definition, but I mean, there are, they will take into account like other definitions, but this is their main definition. So an example of where we're still arguing about what's a species, what's a subspecies, is in the Preble's jumping mouse. So this is a really controversial example in the communities around where this mouse is found. It's believed that it's been around since the great glaciers receded from the southwestern United States. And as time went on and the climate got drier, they were forced to only live in the riparian systems. And they're only found in 7 counties in Colorado and Wyoming. So they have a very, very small range. And this Preble's jumping mouse, it's one of 14 subspecies of jumping mice, but some groups are arguing that it shouldn't be protected or considered its own subspecies. And the mouse was listed in 1998 as threatened, and since then its identity has been disputed. There's been multiple legal challenges. People have filed lawsuits. They have been trying to get this mouse delisted because they feel it looks too much like the other jumping mice. And in November of 2017, the Rocky Mountain Wild and the Center for Biological Diversity filed a petition with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to continue protecting the Preble's jumping mouse under the Endangered Species Act. But a private property group, which owns a lot of land where this mouse is found, petitioned the Fish and Wildlife Service in March of 2017, earlier that year, to strip the protections for this mouse. And they were arguing that new genetic information might invalidate its status as a subspecies. So there's still so much controversy over what we should consider a species, what we consider a subspecies, what we should protect. But as of this point, the Fish and Wildlife Service have not delisted it. They found the evidence to not be of any value. So there is still pressure from landowners, but the mouse is still doing well. Well, relatively well. It's still being protected. But this is just one example. And this is an example of something that you wouldn't think people would be arguing about. But because, like we discussed last time, about this, which species we give attention to, this is one of those species that kind of has been lost in the shuffle. It's one of those species that we don't put a lot of effort into publicizing. So as a conservation biologist, it's hard to determine like which species we should be advocating for and telling more about. We wish we could do all of them, but a lot of people, not me, I like them, but a lot of people don't like mice, and a lot of people are less willing to sacrifice parts of their life and sacrifice where they could build because of something like a mouse. But that's part of our job as conservation biologists, to advocate for even the things that people don't like. So another example of a big argument about what is a species and what's not is with the red wolf. So Canis rufus, or the red wolf, it's from the southeastern United States. It used to range from Texas all the way to Florida and as far north as even Pennsylvania. So it had a huge range. But from increased hunting and over harvesting and loss of habitat, it's now only found in the eastern side of North Carolina. So its range has shrunk considerably. It's considered critically endangered, and we've tried to come up with a recovery plan. We tried to do captive breeding and reintroductions, but they had trouble finding purebred red wolves. Because where the former range was, it had been developed, their habitat had been wiped out, and there weren't many large tracts of land where we could find populations living already. So we did find a handful of them in eastern Texas, and we started a captive breeding program. They're no longer wild in eastern Texas. Like I said, they're only in North Carolina now. And morphologically, scientists were confident that they were a separate subspecies of a wolf. The problem is genetic analysis caused a bunch of debate. So they looked at the mitochondrial DNA of the red wolves, and they found that it's actually closer to that of a coyote. So they then thought, people said, the red wolf, not a valid species, right? It's just maybe a hybrid between a coyote and a gray wolf. So because hybrids aren't subject to protection under the Endangered Species Act, they were going to delist it. So people said that it was just our activities that led to them changing their habitat and interbreeding with coyotes and gray wolves interbreeding and causing this red wolf. And there are still people that believe this today. But recent evidence shows that when you look at the bigger picture and you look at their phylogenetic tree here, the reason that the mitochondrial DNA of red wolves and coyotes are so similar is because they share a more common ancestor. So coyote is more closely related to a red wolf. And they're probably not a hybrid, they're just closer on the phylogenetic tree. So then more evidence came out that everything we were calling a gray wolf wasn't all gray wolves. There was actually another kind of wolf, the eastern wolf. And it wasn't really one of the subspecies of gray wolf. It's its own species. And that one is actually even more closely related to the red wolf. So they actually share the common ancestor with the coyote as well. So that evidence really kind of convinced some people that we need to protect them. But the red wolf still is not listed in CITES, which is, if you remember, is the International Trade Agreement. But a plus for the red wolf is they have now been listed on the IUCN Red List. So that's our international list, and they are considered critically endangered. So we are working to protect them. They've been listed since 1996 now, and there's still controversy. People still argue about it. They still don't want them to be their own species, but the IUCN has not delisted them at this point. They're still listed. So a little bit of a success story. With some genetic evidence, we're able to determine that this is in fact its own species. So, I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I still hear all the time people talking about them being just they're coy wolves, they tell me. It's probably because I know a lot of people in North Carolina. But there's still people that don't believe it, but they are their own species. Same with the eastern wolf, and then we have all the other gray wolf subspecies there. So I just mentioned the IUCN, and what the IUCN Red List is it's an international union for the conservation of nature. And this was developed to clarify and classify based on the risk of global extinction. So they have a specific framework for how they do things. They try to be objective. They go by the evidence, and their emphasis is on the risk of extinction. And you guys are actually going to do a lot of work with the IUCN this class. So when you're using your species sheets every week, you're going to be looking at the IUCN Red List to find species that you're going to use. You're also going to have a lab that looks at it later in the semester. So they do have 9 categories that they rank from highest to lowest risk. There's multiple criteria that go into those calculations. It's not just one thing. They don't just look at how many of the individuals are left. What they look at is they look at the rate of decline. And depending on the rate of decline, they'll have different categories within that. They look at the population size. They look at the geographic area that they're around in, and they look at the vulnerability to fragmentation. So there's a few categories that they look at. And then once they look at all of this, they'll sort every species into one of these categories. And you'll probably recognize most of these. This is a very common label that we give species, and it's from the IUCN Red List. Anytime you look up anything on Wikipedia, if you ever look up a species, they'll have their IUCN category on there. So this is the main system that we use in the United States, actually in North America. So they can rank things as extinct in the wild, which means there may still be some alive in captivity, but none in the wild. Critically endangered, vulnerable, conservation dependent. So this is saying that they will become threatened without a conservation program. Near threatened, least concern. And then data deficient is saying there's not enough information, and not evaluated is hasn't been looked at. There are very few in data deficient and not evaluated. Most things have been looked at, or at least things that you would know of have been looked at. Of course, there are a ton of species, so a lot of the smaller things have not been looked at. And there are some that we haven't even described yet. So there are other ranking systems that look at the threat of extinction on smaller scales. So the IUCN goes by its entire population. These ones, NatureServe and TNC, which is the Nature Conservancy, they emphasize populations. So they look on smaller scales. And they're used for species taxa, and they're also used for ecological communities. So it's not just looking at individual species. So these were developed for North America, Latin America, the Caribbean, and they don't look at captive individuals. So there is no extinct in the wild. It's just extinct or it's not. If it says extinct, there may still be some in captivity, but they're not taking into account captive individuals. there are two parts to the rankings. So there's a number and a letter. And the number is their status with a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being the most imperiled and 5 being the least. Then they're on the number scale, there's also, they actually have 2 letters on that as well, X being extinct and H being possibly extinct. Then they have a letter. And the letter is just saying whether this status is globally, nationally, or on the state level. So they'll use the largest scale possible. But if you are looking at, let's say you just wanted to look at something in Pennsylvania or in New York, then you would have an S before it because you're just looking at that state. So there are a lot of categories within that, a lot of ways to do the combinations. So we're just going to look at global and state. So for global, we have 1 through 5. We have G1 through G5, and those are most imperiled to secure. Then for GX, it's presumed extinct. And these are believed to be extinct throughout their range. There's no evidence that they are still alive. And then there's possibly extinct. So those are ones we're not 100% sure about, but we still have not seen any. But there's still some hope. Maybe there's some out there that we haven't found. And then we have our state level, which these are almost exactly the same, especially with the 1 through 5. Those are the same. It's just on the state level. What makes them different is the X and the H. So X is extirpated from the state. So it's no longer found in the state. It's been removed from the state. And then H is historical. So this is saying it once occurred in the state, but we haven't seen it within the last 20 years. It may still be there, but we're not sure. That's pretty much what that's saying. So when we're looking at this, there's actually a mathematical way for us to define species diversity. So how diverse species are. So your lab this week is going to look at this. You're actually going to do some of these calculations. And there's 2 factors that go into species diversity, and that's the species richness, which is the number of species. So that's just literally counting how many species there are, how many different species. And then there's species evenness, which is the distribution of individuals between species. So you could have 2 populations that both have 10 species in each ecosystem, but maybe one of them has 100 individuals of each one, and it's all even, and the other one has 90 individuals of one, and then 1 or 2 individuals of everything else. So the evenness comes in there. So your healthier population would be the one that's more even. So species diversity combines richness and evenness, and you're actually going to do that calculation, like I said, for your lab, and you're going to see which combinations have the better species diversity. So now we're going to move on. We're going to go to community or ecosystem diversity. So ecosystem diversity is one of the levels of biodiversity. An ecosystem is biotic and abiotic components of an area. So it's everything living and non-living. It's not just including the species. And again, just like with species, ecosystems have instrumental and intrinsic value. So again, the instrumental values would be things like oxygen production, nutrient cycles, nitrogen fixation, medicine, food, aesthetic, all of those things we've talked about a few times. And then intrinsic would be, do they have value in and of themselves? So are ecosystems the sum of their parts, or do they have properties that make them more? So the ecosystem, it does not just take into account the individual species. This on the left is not an ecosystem, right? An ecosystem needs to have everything. It's these species, plants, animals, fungi, whatever, are all a part of the puzzle. So they're all part of the greater ecosystem. So when this is an example of why it's not just best to look at species diversity, right? If you evaluate the species evenness and the species richness of each of these areas, when you're looking at just the types of trees, you would think that A or B would be the healthiest because they have a different amount of different types of trees. They're more even. They've got a different makeup. Whereas when you look at C, it looks like there's only like one of that tree, one of that tree, one of that tree, and the rest is this other tree. But that's not all that comes into account, which is why it's important to look at ecosystems. Because when you're looking at even just this pictures, you can see that this ecosystem may be more healthy because more sun is getting through and now you have an understory. Not to say that these are not important ecosystems as well. There are shaded forests that are just as important, but it's not all about species diversity. There's more that comes into it. So you can't just look at species diversity and say, well, better protect these two because this one's got the least species diversity. There's other things that you need to take into account. So, like I said, an ecosystem is all the organisms in a given area interacting with their physical environment so that a flow of energy leads to a trophic structure. So biotic diversity and material structures, material cycles. So it's everything that's happening. Another thing that ecosystem diversity should take into account, which species diversity doesn't, is the rarity within an ecosystem. So it's not just about how many species there are, because when you're looking at this, for example, if you're just looking at species diversity, you would think, okay, forest, right? Five species here, 4 here, 3 here. Well, obviously forest is the best, marsh is the second, and prairie is the least, right? So we should protect the forest because that would protect the most species. But no, that's not what you want to look at, because for anyone that is from the area, I'm sure we all know that raccoons and white-tailed deer and gray squirrels are all pretty common, right? We don't have any shortage of those animals. Same thing with shagbark, hickory, and black oaks. These are all decently common. When you go to the marsh, little less common than some of these other species, but still pretty common species. Red-winged blackbirds, if you ever go out in the spring, that's probably the only thing you will hear if you go to a pond. Muskrats are decently common. Painted turtles, if you've been to the nature preserve on campus, literally every turtle you see will be a painted turtle. There's a couple snapping turtles, but I've seen probably over 100 painted turtles in the nature preserve. Again, reed grass, all things that are relatively common. But then you go to the prairie, black-footed ferrets, horned larks, and prairie clovers are all endangered. So we don't want to protect just based on how many species. We need to take into account everything about those species. So if we were protecting an ecosystem, we're not just going to go by species richness. We're going to go by the rarity of what can be found there and the best good that we can do. So why would more diversity lead to stability? So if you think about it this way, let's say you had an ecosystem that had a ton of similar species in the ecosystem. They're all going to probably be living in a similar manner, right? There's going to be more competition. They might be eating the same things. So when you have more diversity, the ecosystem's able to function better, because you may, even if you have 4 different types of lizards, they may have different specializations. So the more diverse they are, maybe you'll have an arboreal one that likes to be at the top of the trees. Maybe there's one that likes to hang in the bottom of the trees, one in the grasses, one underwater. So they all fill a different niche, and there's less competition. They're more saturated in the niches that they fill, which actually leaves less room for invasives to come in. And diverse ecosystems, individual species typically contain less individuals within a population. So in ecosystems that aren't diverse, you'll have a lot of the same species. You're probably going to have a similar number of individuals, but because there's less species, you're going to have more of the same species in a less diverse ecosystem. And that might sound better at first because you're thinking, well, okay, a couple die off. It's not so big of a deal, right? Because there's still a ton left. But the problem with there being so many of the same species in one area is that they're all very close together and they're all very similar, so disease spreads more. It also leaves other, like I said, other niches open for invasive species to fill. So you really want diversity within your ecosystem to protect the ecosystem. So a good example of this is think of a monoculture of plants. So think about farms. Farms have a lot of problems, especially with pests. And the reason pests are so attracted to farms is because there's a never-ending supply of the same food that they like. So when you have a similar type of thing all over in one ecosystem, you're gonna leave that open to more issues. If one crop gets infected with a disease, it's going to spread more easily because it's completely surrounded by something that disease can spread to. Whereas if the crop, so you have one crop here and then a bunch of other stuff in between and another one on the other side of that, it's not going to interact as well because the disease might not be able to infect all of the things that are in between. So diversity is really key. So ecosystem boundaries are often unclear and the scale can vary. So when I say ecosystem diversity, there's no one size of an ecosystem. There's no specific line that divides every ecosystem. So there is a way to look at ecosystem diversity that was developed by someone named Robert Whitaker. He's a very important scientist. He also came up with the 5 kingdom system, which is the 5 kingdoms that we classify species into, which is like Animalia, Plantae, Fungi, Protista, and Monera. So he came up with that. And he also looked at biodiversity, and he distinguished 3 different geographic levels to analyze ecosystem diversity. Okay, so he came up with the alpha, beta, and gamma levels, and we're going to get into the math of it in a second. Alpha is looking at the local species richness. So all that's saying is how many species are present at this site. Gamma, I know I skipped beta, but it makes more sense to go in this order. Gamma is looking at the total species richness of all of the sites in a region. So all the sites. So let's say you have 3 fields, right? And one field has 3 species, the next field has 4 species, but 2 of them are the same as the first one. And the next one has 3 species that are all the same as the first ones. So you're going to end up with 5 total species because you have 5 different species across the 3 fields. And you're going to see that laid out in a second. So if that's confusing, don't worry. We're going to go right back to it in a second. Beta is the variation in species diversity at different sites within a region. So it's the highest when areas contain different species. And mathematically, the way we look at that is we divide the average out. We divide average alpha by gamma, or gamma by average alpha. Sorry, we gamma divided by average alpha. So what we do there, we'll look at this. So we have some examples here. So we have 3 mountains. We have 3 regions. We're going to look at each region separately. Pretend like they are completely separate problems, okay? So when you're looking at region 1, I'll go through the first one with you, and then you can pause the video and see if you can figure out the second and third ones on your own. And then I'll go through them afterwards. If you want to pause it now and because you think you can do it, you can do that now as well. So for region 1, alpha will be the species per mountain. So the average. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So the average of 6, 5, 7 would be 6. So we're doing 6 plus 5 plus 7 divided by 3, right? Gamma would be species per region. So how many species are there across all of this? So we have A, B, C, D, E, F, that's 6. We already had B, C, D, E, F, A, B, C, D, E, F. Oh, there's a new one, G, right? So 7, because A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Then we're going to do gamma divided by alpha. So 7 divided by 6. And when you do that, you get 1.2. So that is your diversity, your ecosystem diversity there. So now if you want, you can pause, see if you can do the other two on your own. I'll give a second for you to pause. Okay, so for region 2, we have A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and then we have D, G, and then we have H, I, J. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Well, 4 per mountain, 10 total, right? So we have 3, 4, 5, 4. And then beta will be 10 divided by 4, 2.5. Region 3, for alpha, we do species per mountain. So we have 2, 3, 4, comes out to 3. And then we have A, B, C, D, E, E, F, G, H. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 divided by 3 is 2.7. So when you're looking at this, if you looked at this, you would think, okay, look how many species, look how many individuals there are. Different species are on each mountain. 1 looks great, right? 1 actually has the lowest beta, which means it's actually the least diverse. So we look at this, they don't really have a lot of different species per mountain, but there's so many different species, right? So every mountain is different, which gives them the highest ecosystem diversity because each ecosystem is different from one another. Whereas here, the ecosystems are very similar to one another, right? So we have 3 of almost the same thing. So we would really focus on region 3 if we were looking for one to help. So this is an example of why diversity is important and why you can't just look at species diversity. So we have Clear Lake, which is a warm water lake in California. It's very productive. It has lots of fish. Originally, this lake had 12 species, and 3 of those species were endemic. And what endemic means is they are only native to a very small area. So they're only found in this lake. That's the only place in the world that you can find them. So they dammed up one of the outlet rivers, which caused a loss of 2 of their migratory species. And they also introduced a lot of non-native species for bait fish. So what happened is they introduced these non-native species and those took over. They became the most common fish. So they even introduced carp, catfishes, and sunfishes. They all kind of took over. And as a result, there were changes in the fish community. So originally they started with 12 species, but now the lake has 25 species. So looking at the species diversity there, it seems like that's actually better, right? 12 species seems a lot, is less than half. But the problem here is only 4 of the original 12 are still common, and 2 of the native species went globally extinct. So the gamma diversity actually decreased from 12 to 10. So that's an issue, right? That means we should have been protecting this ecosystem. And now, even though there's more species, it's actually doing more poorly than it had been before. So when we're defining the boundaries of an ecosystem, it's kind of hard to just see a clear boundary. So we think of that the boundary means that 2 ecosystems, one on each side, is different from one another. So we look at the difference in the communities. And there is a mathematical way to do this. The formula is 2C divided by A plus B, where C is the species that the two areas have in common. A is a species in area A, and B is a species in area B. So what we do, if you're looking at this picture, where would we put the boundary here, right? So what we would do is, let's say we wanted to say that this right here on the left, these small trees, is a different ecosystem than the trees on the right. We would say that we would need to do our formula, which, if you remember, is 2C divided by A plus B. So we would do 2 times the species that the areas have in common, divided by the species that we find here, divided by the species we found here, over the species we found here. So what we would see is probably that they are different, right? Because these are mostly different species than that. But it's not always that simple, right? Even looking at this, there's a possibility these are similar species in the understory. So maybe they will be too similar. So it's where we make that cutoff that is the question. So here's an example. We looked at 3 ecosystems. They all have the same 4 species. So if we're just looking at the number of species there and the types of species, they would all be the same. The problem is they'd have different species makeups. So when we look at A versus B, those are very similar. This would be the same ecosystem. But when we compare B to C or A to C, you can see C is different than both of these. So we can calculate the similarity index, and even though they have the same species, ecosystem C would be considered a new ecosystem, even though it's the same species. So when we are looking at protecting ecosystems, there's a couple ways to do it. We can use a coarse filter or a fine filter. And a coarse filter, what that is saying is that you are going to protect the entire ecosystem, and therefore all of the species that it contains. So typically that gets most of the species in the ecosystem, but there are some that get missed. So those could be species that are maybe too motile, they move around, they maybe migrate in and out. So they may be species that even maybe rely on a food source that's outside, but live in that ecosystem. So it doesn't get everything, but it gets a good chunk of what is in that area. Then you have your fine filter, which targets a specific species that's missed by the coarse filter. So it's species-specific management. And when you're protecting an ecosystem, you're not picking one, right? You're not just doing one. You may have a combination of both. So you could have a coarse filter protect the whole ecosystem and then put extra effort into protecting specific species that need your help and got left out. So an example, you could protect a coral reef, right? But you're not going to protect all the species that use the reef, because some species, like, for example, a sea turtle, is not going to spend all their time in that reef. So that's when you would use a fine filter to target the species that you missed. And they're not going to necessarily target every single species that was missed in the coarse filter, but you can target the ones that need help the most. Okay, so going back to the diversity of ecosystems, Whitaker, who came up with the alpha, beta, gamma method of measuring ecosystem diversity, also proposed something called the Whitaker biome classification. And what that is he decided that every biome on Earth can be categorized based on 2 factors, which are precipitation and temperature. So just those 2 factors make each biome unique enough to be considered different biomes. So where you can use the alpha, beta, gamma method to measure ecosystem diversity. You can use this method to look at what makes a biome, what makes them diverse and different. And just an increase or decrease in either the precipitation or the temperature will switch something from one biome to another. So what's interesting is the more up and to the left you go, the higher the species diversity. So just based on more precipitation and a higher temperature, more species can live there. But that doesn't mean this is the only place we want to protect, right? So we'll get into why these places still matter in a second. So even though some of these areas have less species, like the polar ice, right? That has less species. Some of them are also very rare and have less species. So when we're looking at certain places like temperate grasslands, right? There's less temperate grasslands out there, but they're still important habitats for certain species. So even though some might be a larger biome and might have more species, doesn't discredit the ones that are smaller and have less species. There are other things that come into account when we're deciding what to protect. So remember, when we're looking at ecosystem diversity and we're looking at what to protect, we're looking at what is found in each ecosystem, the services that the ecosystem gives us. We're looking at how common the ecosystem in general is, the dispersal of species and everything within the ecosystem. So we're really, with ecosystem diversity, we're combining everything. So the last topic for today are hotspots and cold spots. There's a enormous need for conservation in biodiversity hotspots, but we have limited resources. We can only protect so much. And hotspots are an approach to conservation that try to protect areas with exceptional concentrations of endemic species and with an exceptional loss of habitat. And remember, I told you endemic species means that they are only found in a small range, and that's the only place on Earth they're found. They're native to a tiny area. So Myers, which I believe I have a paper up that discusses hotspots for you. He identified 34 areas that consist of only 15.7% of the land area, but contain 77% of terrestrial vertebrates. So that sounds great, right? We go ahead and we protect that 15.7%, and we got 77% of vertebrates there. Here are all of our biodiversity hotspots that we have on Earth. And most of the plants that we find in hotspots are endemic, which again means that they can't be found anywhere else in the world. They're just native to that small range. And endemic species are usually more vulnerable to extinction because they only have that small area. So if one population goes extinct, they're extinct everywhere. To be classified as a biodiversity hotspot, the region must have lost at least 70% of its natural vegetation. And that's usually due to human activities. There are over 30 biodiversity hotspots in the world, so there's quite a few of them, but like I said before, it only makes up a small amount of the landmass. So, for example, the Andes Mountain tropical hotspot, it actually has about a sixth of all plant species in this one region. And the New Zealand hotspot is, you can see it's even brighter than everywhere else. It actually is an area that's super important because it has a ton of endemic species. It's an island, so everything evolved in isolation. And more than 90% of their insects and 80% of their plants are endemic to that region. So they're only found there. Another example, the Himalayan region has the tallest mountains in the world, and it has incredible animals that are found only there, including the giant panda, the water buffalo, the black-necked crane, which is actually the only alpine crane in the entire world. So it's even more it's more significantly different than a lot of other things. Um, so the problem is deforestation, climate change, all of these things have made some of these areas hotspots because they've lost a ton of their regions. So naturally, it makes sense. We'll protect these areas, right? But there is some controversy on how much effort we should put into these areas. So some people think it's enough to just put all of our efforts into these areas. But what about all of the other species? So we need to put effort into protecting them too. But the question is how much? So how much effort do we put towards these areas versus the other areas? So an alternative is the conservation of cold spots. So this is a hypothesis that was put forth by Karivia and Marvier. This is one of the supplemental readings that I uploaded that you can use for the extra credit. And what they do is they emphasize different things. So they argue that there's issues with how hotspots quantify diversity. Hotspots focus on species richness, which we've talked about a ton today, and about how species richness isn't always the only thing, right? There are other things that come into play. So with hotspots, a lot of the times they just tally up the number of endemic plant species, not even animals, just plants, not a combination, right? But Kariva and Marvier argue that hotspots are often missing the rare species, and major animal groups might be lost if we devote all of our attention to the areas with high numbers of endemic plants. So the reason hotspots are mostly defined by looking at plants is because there's simply just more data on plants, right? They don't move. We can just get a ton of data on plants. There's more than there is for animals. Even then, when we look at the degree of loss, they look at the loss of the primary vegetation. So again, with just plants, which I'm not saying there's anything wrong with looking at plants, right? We should look at all of it though. We should look at plants, animals, fungi, everything. But again, that's hard to do, right? And it's not to say that protecting the hotspots isn't important. It definitely is important. But the loss of vegetation is more about the way the land has been used, and we can more easily cut off some of these activities that are getting rid of the land, like stop with building new structures and tearing down these areas. But it doesn't really say much about future and lasting threats. So many threats to species aren't seen in the loss of vegetation cover. So we need to look at other variables. Some scientists suggest that a more accurate analysis of this danger might be to look at the rate of human population growth nearby, or in the fraction of species in the area that are at risk. So another reason that protecting hotspots has an issue is the lack of habitat diversity. So there are so many underrepresented ecosystems in hotspots. It's also important to protect other areas to provide the greatest variety of distinct plant and animal lineages for future evolutionary breakthroughs. So we want to have more distinct areas instead of so many places that are very similar. So here you can see the areas with the highest number of endangered mammal and bird genera aren't always hotspots. When you look at the map up top, that is showing the areas that have the highest number of mammal and bird genera. But you can see many of the hotspots are not within those areas, right? These are all hotspots in here, and none of these have endangered species the way that some of the other areas do. So we really need to look into other ways as well. We don't want to just put all of our energy on hotspots. So here's a hypothetical example. It shows some of the issues that emphasizing hotspots above all else might have. So when you look at Ecuador and you look at Montana, they're roughly the same size, right? Ecuador is a well-known hotspot. It has 2,466 vertebrates. It's got over 19,000 plant species. Whereas Montana only has about 12% of that. They have a much lower species richness. And just looking at those numbers, it would make sense. You'd be like, okay, Ecuador, we should protect Ecuador over Montana. But if we want to protect both of these areas, it's actually possible. So there's still ways to do that. So suppose we wanted to protect 20,000 species. So we were going to put our efforts into 20,000 species. And we wanted to do it across both of these areas. And we had a couple options. Maybe we wanted to protect 18,000 species in Ecuador and 2,000 in Montana. Or maybe we thought 19,000 in Ecuador and 1,000 in Montana. It might not sound like a big difference there, right? 18,000, 19,000, 1,000, 2,000, not a big difference. But even though they sound similar, they're really different in practice. So 18,000 or 19,000 species in Ecuador is 82% of species versus 87%. So not a huge difference there. But 1,000 versus 2,000 species in Montana would be 37% versus 74% of species. So there's a huge difference for Montana. So by just protecting 82% of the species in Ecuador instead of 87%, we can protect almost 3/4 of the species in Montana. So this is the proposal for cold spots, right? This is what Kariva and Merriver wanted us to think about. It's not about stopping our protection of hotspots. It's about spreading our protection to other areas and using the same amount of effort to encompass other species. And the reason cold spots are so important is because they contain more genetically diverse species than you would find in that extra 1,000 that you would have protected in Ecuador. So, for example, the conservation efforts in Montana would also lead to protecting part of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And this is the only place in the lower 48 states where we still have large mammals like grizzly bears, wolves, bison, and elk roaming free. So the number of species and the percent of species in a country isn't always the best thing. If we can split it, we can do a decent percent of species in this area and this area, right? Just by splitting our efforts a little bit and not putting it all into one thing. So there's also an argument that maybe instead of focusing on hot spots and cold spots, we should focus on the areas that give us the most ecosystem services. So this is sort of an anthropocentric view because we're looking at areas that we think give us the most, right? But a lot of these ecosystem services aren't just important for us, right? A lot of them are important for the whole world, for all of the other animals. So there are 17 recognized ecosystem services, and a lot of them are equally important for animals as they are for us. So for example, pollination, water regulation, water supplies, climate regulation, gas regulation, these are all so important. Soil formation, nutrient cycling, these are all important things that we should be protecting. And it's actually been estimated that these services that the earth gives us for free, if we were to have to replace these artificially, it would be astronomical in cost. So the minimum value that our ecosystem services is estimated to be, and this is just in the US, in 1 year is between $16 and $54 trillion. So if we don't protect these areas that are providing these free services that are taking care of us, we will be having to spend that much money, which no, it's a ridiculous amount of money to replace these services. And you can just think of the terrible repercussions there would be for all of the animals that are losing these services because we are getting rid of their environments and all of these services that they provide. Okay, so I know it was a little bit of a long one, but that is it for today. Next week we will get into genetic diversity and we'll move on to some other topics after that. Have a great week.